The doctor looked at Bruce Lee and said 4 words that no athlete ever wants to hear. You will never fight again. Bruce Lee said nothing. He went home, he got into bed, and then he did something that nobody expected. This is the story of the 6 months that should have ended Bruce Lee's career and instead created his greatest legacy. It was August 13th, 1970. Bruce Lee was 29 years old. He was not yet the global icon the world would come to know, but he was on the edge of becoming something extraordinary. He had already appeared on American television as Kato in The Green Hornet. He was teaching private martial arts lessons to some of the biggest names in Hollywood: James Coburn, Steve McQueen, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He had been developing a revolutionary new fighting philosophy he called Jeet Kune Do. He was writing, training, thinking, planning. Every single day was moving him closer to the thing he had been building his whole life toward. But before we talk about what happened on that August morning, we need to understand who Bruce Lee was in 1970, because to understand what the injury took from him, you first need to understand what he had already given everything to build. Bruce Lee had arrived in America with almost nothing. He was 18 years old when his parents put him on a ship from Hong Kong in 1959, handed him a small amount of money, and told him to make something of himself. He had been getting into street fights, running with gangs, embarrassing the family. America was supposed to be a fresh start. Instead, it became the proving ground for one of the most relentless self-reinventions in the history of modern culture. He waited tables in Seattle. He gave cha-cha dancing lessons to earn rent. He had been the Hong Kong cha-cha champion in 1958, and he used that skill to survive. He enrolled at the University of Washington, where he began teaching kung fu out of a parking lot to anyone willing to show up. The classes grew. His reputation spread. He was magnetic, ferociously intelligent, and possessed of a physical ability that made people stop whatever they were doing just to watch him move. He married Linda Emery in 1964, a white woman from Seattle, a union that both families resisted. He opened martial arts schools. He trained obsessively, combining Wing Chun with boxing, fencing, philosophy, anything he could absorb and adapt. He wasn't just practicing martial arts, he was reinventing them from the inside out, asking what was actually useful and what was just inherited habit dressed up as wisdom. By the late 1960s, his private client list read like a Hollywood directory. Steve McQueen paid for private lessons and spoke about Bruce with genuine reverence. James Coburn was a devoted student. These were not casual celebrity endorsements. These were serious, committed students who recognized that Bruce Lee understood something about the human body and the nature of combat that nobody else was teaching.
And yet, despite all of this, despite the talent, the charisma, the famous students, the television role, Hollywood still wouldn't give him a leading part. The studios were polite, they admired him, and then they cast someone else. The system had decided in its quiet, institutional way that a Chinese man could not carry an American film. Bruce Lee knew this, he burned with it, and he channeled that fury into training harder, thinking deeper, building toward the day when the world would have no choice but to look at him directly. That was the man who picked up a 125-pound barbell on the morning of August 13th, 1970. He was performing an exercise called Good Mornings, a movement that involves bending forward at the waist while holding the barbell across the shoulders. It is a demanding exercise that places enormous stress on the lower back, and it requires a thorough warm-up before you attempt it at any serious weight. That morning, Bruce Lee skipped the warm-up. He was always in a hurry. There was always more to do, more to build, more to prove. He loaded the bar and began. Somewhere in that motion, something gave way. He felt a sharp, sudden pain explode through his lower back. He stopped. He set the bar down. He stood very still, breathing slowly, hoping, the way athletes always hope in that terrible first moment, that it was just a muscle spasm, just a twinge, just something that would fade in a day or two. It did not fade. Over the following days, the pain grew steadily worse. Simple movements became difficult. Getting up from a chair was agony. Sleep was nearly impossible. When he finally went to see doctors and the examinations were finished, the conclusion was delivered with the flat certainty of medicine that has nothing good to say. Bruce Lee had permanently damaged the fourth sacral nerve in his lower back. The injury could not be reversed. There was no surgical option that would restore what had been lost. He would need to wear a back brace for 6 months, remain largely in bed, and avoid all physical exertion entirely. And then came those 4 words, "You will never fight again." For most people, a serious injury is a setback, painful, disruptive, frightening, but ultimately something you recover from and move beyond. For Bruce Lee, this was an existential threat of an entirely different order. His body was not just his instrument, it was his argument. Every time he moved, he was making a case to the world. Every kick, every demonstration, every private lesson was evidence that he was undeniable. Whatever the studios decided about his face or his accent or his marketability, they could not deny what they saw when he moved. Take that away, and what remained? He had a wife. He had 2 young children. Brandon was 5 years old. Shannon was just an infant. He had bills. He had a career that had been built entirely on his physical ability and that had not yet reached the point where it could sustain itself on reputation alone. He had plans, screenplays, ideas, dreams, and a back that could no longer do the one thing that made it all possible. The weeks that followed were, by all accounts, the darkest period of his life. Linda Lee later described those months with quiet honesty. Bruce was not a man who talked openly about despair. He was not someone who admitted weakness in words, but the people closest to him saw it. They saw the restlessness of a man who had always defined himself through movement, suddenly forced to complete stillness. They saw the frustration of someone who had built his entire identity around discipline and control, watching both slip from his hands. They saw him lying in that bed, day after day, while the world continued without him.
Linda held everything together. She managed the household, took care of Brandon and Shannon, handled the finances, and sat with Bruce through the long, painful days when there was nothing to do but endure. She was the container that held the family, while Bruce found his way through the dark. And somewhere in those long, silent, painful days, Bruce Lee picked up a pen. He had always been a reader. His personal library contained hundreds of volumes: Eastern philosophy, Western psychology, boxing theory, fencing manuals, Zen Buddhism, Taoism, books on anatomy and biomechanics, and the psychology of performance. He had been absorbing ideas his entire adult life, filling notebooks with observations and fragments and half-formed theories that he had never had time to develop fully. He was always moving too fast. There was always training to do, always students waiting, always the next goal pulling him forward. Now there was nothing pulling him anywhere. Now there was only the ceiling and the pain and the silence. He began to write. Not letters, not a diary, not the scattered fragments he had always kept. Something different, systematic, deliberate, complete. He began to construct the full, coherent expression of everything he had been thinking and practicing and teaching for the past decade. He wrote about the nature of real combat, stripped of tradition and ego and the artificial constraints of fixed style. He wrote about why clinging to a single method was the surest path to predictability, and why predictability in a fight was a kind of death. He wrote about the relationship between the mind and the body, about how hesitation was the enemy of action, about how the highest level of skill was not mastery of technique, but the total absence of self-consciousness in the moment of movement, the state where thinking ends and being begins. Page after page, day after day, lying in that bed with a back brace and a notebook, he poured onto paper everything he knew about what it meant to fight without fighting, to move without thinking, to be completely present in a single moment of physical truth. He wrote about Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist, not a style, not a school with a fixed curriculum and a syllabus and a set of approved techniques, a philosophy of combat that had no permanent form, that was designed by its very nature to absorb what was useful, discard what was not, and add what was uniquely and honestly his own. Absorb what is useful, discard what is not, add what is uniquely your own. He wrote those words during those months. They would become among the most quoted sentences in the history of martial arts. And he wrote about water. Water has no fixed shape. It takes the shape of whatever contains it. Put it in a cup, it becomes the cup. Put it in a bowl, it becomes the bowl. It flows around obstacles rather than fighting them. It finds the lowest point and settles there patiently. It does not insist on its own form, but given enough time, water carves canyons through stone. Lying immobile, his body temporarily taken from him, the metaphor became personal in a way it had never been before. He could not force his way through this. He could not punch or kick or outrun what had happened to him. He had no choice right now but to be soft, to be patient, to find the shape of the container he had been placed in. Be water, my friend. But he did something else during those months that the mythology of Bruce Lee often overlooks. He did not simply lie in bed and write and wait. He studied his own injury with the same obsessive precision he had always applied to his training. He read everything he could find about spinal rehabilitation. He consulted specialists. He mapped the biomechanics of his own movement, looking for ways to rebuild strength around the damaged nerve without aggravating the injury further. He designed a recovery program for himself from the ground up, starting from the smallest possible movements, progressing with agonizing slowness, tracking everything, adjusting everything, applying his mind to his body as a problem to be solved rather than a sentence to be served.
This was not simply willpower. This was intelligence. The same fierce, disciplined, detail-obsessed intelligence that had made him extraordinary as a fighter now applied to the question of how to come back from something that was not supposed to be survivable. 5 months after the injury, 5 months after the doctor had delivered that 4-word verdict, Bruce Lee returned to light training. His doctors were genuinely stunned. The nerve damage was still there. It would never heal. The chronic pain that had begun on that August morning would stay with Bruce Lee for every day of the rest of his life. Every fight scene he filmed after 1970, every kick, every training demonstration, every physical performance in his final 3 years was conducted against a backdrop of pain that he never mentioned publicly and rarely acknowledged privately. The people who worked with him in those years have spoken about this since, about how he managed it, absorbed it, built around it, refused to let it define the boundaries of what he was willing to attempt. By 1971, Raymond Chow offered Bruce Lee a deal to make films in Hong Kong. He accepted. The Big Boss, released in 1971, became the highest-grossing film in Hong Kong history. Fist of Fury broke that record, Way of the Dragon followed, and then in 1973, Enter the Dragon, the first Hollywood-produced film ever to star an Asian actor in the lead role, a co-production between Bruce Lee's own company and Warner Bros., the studio that had once quietly decided America wasn't ready for his face. All of it came after the injury. Every frame, every fight, every extraordinary physical achievement of the peak years of Bruce Lee's career was built on the foundation of those 6 months in bed. The man who emerged from that room was not diminished by what had happened. He was clarified. The stillness had done something to him that the movement never could.
It had forced him to sit inside everything he knew and believed until it organized itself into something that could be written down and passed on. The notes from those months were gathered after his death, organized by Linda and his closest colleagues, and published in 1975 under the title Tao of Jeet Kune Do. It became one of the most influential books ever written on martial arts, combat philosophy, and the relationship between physical and mental discipline. It has never gone out of print. It is read today by professional fighters, coaches, movement artists, and people who have never thrown a punch in their lives, but find in Bruce Lee's words something true and transferable about how to be fully present in whatever you are doing. Bruce Lee never held that book in his hands. He never read it as a finished work. He died in July 1973, 2 years before it was published, 6 days before the release of Enter the Dragon, the film that would make him immortal. The words he wrote in pain, in stillness, in the darkest months of his life, outlasted everything else. And that is the real story of those 6 months. Not just the comeback, not just the return to training that stunned the doctors. The real story is what the injury required of him. It required him to stop. It required him to be still. It required him to put down everything he had always used to define himself and sit in the silence of a life temporarily stripped of its armor. And in that silence, he found the thing that no injury could touch, the ideas, the philosophy, the words that have now survived him by more than 50 years and show no sign of stopping. The doctor said 4 words, and Bruce Lee heard them. He went home, he got into bed, and in the silence of everything he had temporarily lost, he built the thing that would never be lost at all. Be water, my friend. If this story moved you, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who is facing something right now that feels impossible to come back from. And tell us in the comments, what does be water mean to you personally? We read every single one, and the answers always remind us why we tell these stories.